basically that $25 fee is to weed out people that just want to create, flood the store with spam. It's not a terribly high fee, but it is one fee that you have to do. But then after that, you are free to submit your applications to the store. There's no review process. And you basically create your application, you publish it to the store, and then that's it. It's up and ready for people to download. That's just one sense that Google might be a little bit more open than Apple. But there's other ways as well. You have a little bit more control over your phone, some people would argue, a little bit more customization. Whereas in iOS, they try to really funnel you towards a certain type of experience, which in itself, I'm framing it not in the sense that this is a negative, but in fact that it's a very different way of thinking about this. Google allows you to have a lot more options, and so it can, to people who are not familiar with the system, appear to be a little bit more complex. And so again, this is just that same sort of idea that we want to point out, the differences between the two. Did you have a question or a difference?
The APIs, are they open source on Android?
So for the longest time, Android was open source, but they have, in fact, closed sourced some of them. So a lot of the code is, in fact, open source, but I think some of the now more basic functions are, in fact, closed source from Google. But yeah, that was also a primary difference between Apple and Android. Again, we could perhaps include this within this openness aspect. What about other things? Anything else as developers that might be different? Yes?
iOS developers might say that Android's more fragmented, versions.
Right, so this is definitely a big one that we hear a lot, is that this fragmentation in Android devices. And in fact, this is a very important point that I want to bring up right away, is that there is some truth to this in what is actually fragmented. There are many different types of hardware devices available with the Google operating system, with the Android operating system, from different manufacturers, whereas Apple is the only manufacturer of iPhone and iPad. There are many different manufacturers that use Android as a platform. And even within that context, many people don't update their software as much as we as developers might want them to. And there's a variety of reasons for this. Some of them may not be aware that there's an update. Some of them, but I think one of the more pressing problems is that with many of the third-party phones that come out that have Android on them, they add a lot of stuff to it. Sort of like when you buy a PC and it has a lot of stuff installed. And my friend just bought an Asus, and he said that it had like oh my gosh, I wish I could remember exactly what it was, but it was like an Asus internet connection help wizard or some sort of very specific thing that he was kind of surprised that they actually bothered. This one hardware company actually bothered to create the software for it. And it's sort of a similar thing. A lot of these companies will, in fact, add their own additional UI components on top of the Android base OS, which further adds to perhaps some of the confusion between different users. When you pick up an Android device from, say, Samsung versus one that Google created with just the base Android OS, it might actually look different, even though it has the same version of the OS, because of these additional little flares and additional pieces of software that they will actually add on to this. Now, I don't want to confuse the issue. All of that stuff aside, one of the base issues in this fragmentation argument is just the wide range of versions that are installed on hardware devices right now. So this is a chart that Google actually created. They release a similar chart every half month or every month or so, showing the distribution of devices that connect to the Google Play Store, which is the equivalent of the App Store on iOS. And as we can see here, there's really no one slice of this pie that makes up the majority of the devices. It really runs the gamut from Gingerbread right here, which is a version 2 of Android OS, which is now several years old, all the way up to Jelly Bean, which is one of the later versions, version 4.1 and 4.2. And now there's an even newer version, 4.3, but I'm not sure that any devices have been released that actually have that, or that it's actually been released at this point. Now, sort of the saving grace here with this is that if you did want to target a lot of these users, you can actually create, of course, an application that is targeted at one of these APIs, one of these earlier APIs, and be able to get a large portion of the market. And by the market, I mean the available market for your application. Of course, if you wanted to use some API that's only available in some later version of the OS, then you will perhaps limit yourself in terms of the market that is available for that. But the Android OS isn't the only reason why this system might be considered fragmented. We also have things such as the screen size and the density. Like I said, the actual hardware devices are very, very different. And this is just, I intentionally left out some of the explanation of some of these, but just to show you that this is really all over the place with screen size on the left and screen density on the right. And Google goes through and on the website differentiating all of these in terms of the exact pixel dimensions and the exact number of dots per inch in each of the densities here. But really, we can see that we have a problem. And that is that if you want to create an application for an Android device that should work on a multitude of devices, you do have to contend with this issue that there are many different types of devices running many different types of OSs that have very different hardware capabilities. Now, to Google's credit, they have done everything that they can to try to combat this issue. They really try hard to make it possible for you to create an application that can run on a lot of these sorts of devices. And in fact, one of the ways that they are able to do this is through this inclusion of resources within an application. So there is, and we're going to get a little bit technical at this moment before we kind of come back a little bit wider and talk about what exactly, how exactly this works. Oh, and it looks like a font is missing here. So, so basically, application resources are stored in a resource folder. It just says RES. And there's a variety of different folders. It's a hierarchy of folders. And within that, there's a variety of other directories that you can include, like a drawable directory, which will include bitmap graphics or XML graphics. And there's also a layout, so that you can actually add layout information in XML form, or you could also add menu definitions in a menu directory as well. And what's really neat about this set of directories is that not only can you localize strings, but also you can modify the name of the directory itself to give a hint to the OS of what sort of resources are included in there. So let's say that you create a game, for instance. And in that game, you have perhaps a variety of assets, a variety of graphics that you've created for different devices. Perhaps you've created some relatively low resolution graphics for the lower DPI devices, or perhaps you've created some really high resolution graphics for the larger screens or for the devices that have very, very high DPI available. And what you can do is very much in the style of a CSS selector, which you might remember from your talk in web development, can you actually add some properties to these folders, which are, again, not intentionally masked here, but you will hopefully see them when you download the PDF when it is posted on the website. But you can actually add CSS style selectors, or not. I don't want to say that. They're selectors in the style of sort of CSS, in the way that you can have these different selectors to target specific hardware devices or specific OS versions within each of these folders. So it becomes a little bit better. You don't have to release different versions of the same application, but you do, as you can imagine, have to create different versions of these assets for these different devices. And even though there's the argument, well, iOS is now fragmented between the iPad mini, and the iPhone, and the older versions, which did not have the Retina displays, and all these different things, it's really not quite as bad as we have here on Android. This is an attempt on Google's part to make it a little bit better. Now, these resources are, in fact, included within a file that's called an APK file. An APK file is, in fact, your Android application. And what's neat about this APK file is that you can actually download an APK file onto your computer. You can rename APK to .zip, unzip it, and see what the contents of that application actually is. It's kind of an interesting thing. You can actually see the resources that are available there. Anything that has not been compiled, it becomes very easy to look at. You can't look at the original source code, of course, because it's been compiled and then included within that zip file and packaged into this Android format. But you can, in fact, look at some of the resources that are available within that one that one file. So this is important to realize that we have this APK file, which is, in fact, this application that we want to ultimately create. Within that application, we have these resources. Again, you can create resources that are generic so that it would apply to all hardware devices, or you could even make them very specific by having multiple drawable directories for different resolutions or for different density screens. And you could create different strings directories for